Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk Math with your friends. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amanda Jansen from the University of Delaware. She's a math educator and the author of the book whose ideas she's discussing today, Rough Draft Math, Revising to Learn. So will everyone please join me in welcoming Dr. Jansen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for hanging out with me. I was really excited to be invited to this. I love the concept of let's create our own colloquia. No matter where we live, we can be together and hang out on Zoom. This is an example of something positive that comes out of COVID, right? So we can create what we want. So thanks for hanging out with me. And just in the chat, I feel, so one thing that's amazing about this is I feel like I get a chance to talk with people that I've interact with on Twitter, but to have real life space is amazing. So if you could share maybe your name and where you work. A lot of us are faculty at universities. So I can say that I work at the University of Delaware, and a lot of us already follow each other. So if we don't already follow each other, let's do that on Twitter. So if you can put in chat just where you work, that would be very cool. So yes, Brian made their recent move to Long Beach, working with math teachers. I'll introduce myself in a little bit and say my role. Yes, Drew, I love having the chance to get to know you through Twitter, University of South Alabama. Tien made the disclaimer of at the moment of where he works. Yes, exactly. So thanks for connecting. I'm sure you all know each other better than you know me. So thank you for putting that in the information. So you see that I post a lot of the time about on Twitter about rough draft math. So you're probably like, what is the deal with this, Mandy? And how does this impact our work in schools? So if you could put something maybe in the chat about your level of familiarity with this idea, right? So if maybe you've never heard of this before, it's a 0. Maybe if it kind of rings a bell, it's a 1. Maybe if you can kind of explain what it is, it's a 2. If you've ever tried anything with it, it's a 3. And if you feel like you could teach other people about it, it's like a 4. Yeah. And you don't need to be humble. Like whatever you feel, I accept as valid. So I appreciate your honesty. If you can put some thoughts. Yeah, Drew, you're probably like 3.5 to 4 for sure. And I love that people haven't heard, if you haven't heard of it, this could be fun and new for you too. So that helps me to kind of see where people are at. So if you don't know me, I work at the University of Delaware. I'm a professor in the School of Education. This is my 18th year there. And I have a joint appointment in our math department. So I have a joint appointment in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at the University of Delaware. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see my building. That's the Willard Hall School of Education. And the next building is just another prettier building on our campus. Schools of education, colleges of education are not the nicest buildings usually. In the bottom left-hand corner is pinball. That's one of my hobbies. I own a pinball machine. I like to play in pinball tournaments. And in the right side, you see me working with kids. I used to be a teacher. So I taught junior high for a few years, and then I went to grad school. So so my undergrad degree is in mathematics from the University of Arizona. And I taught for several years in Arizona. And then I have my PhD in educational psychology from Michigan State. And then I've been at the University of Delaware. And I teach courses like helping future teachers develop their math content knowledge for the math they need to teach, and also pedagogy courses. Ooh, Paul, you know how to fix pinball machines? That's a really super amazing, unique skill. Yeah, so that's beautiful. I only own one pinball machine. So this is just a little bit about me. I work with PhD students in math education. So I know we all have this love of math in common. And sometimes when we think about math education, either capital M for math or capital E for education. And I'm probably more capital E for education, but I also super love math. So it's just hard to pick. But a lot of you might be more capital M for math. So I love that we're here today with our shared interests. And so today I'll be talking about a lot about pedagogy, but I know this group really cares about teaching. And so this will be relevant to you. Okay, I want this to be super interactive, and it's kind of silly to do this in a Padlet when there's just a few of us, but this preserves our ideas. So I'll put this in chat. This link has a Padlet. And so when I think about rough drafts, why would we incorporate rough drafts and revising into math teaching and learning? So one thing that's really cool, especially when kids are above a certain age, is this phrase rough draft has meaning for people, right? So you can just ask students, why could rough drafts be useful in math? And they would have ideas. And if you've never heard about this before either, you already have ideas too, right? So you can put your thinking on this Padlet, and I've set up the Padlet where you can put hearts if you like what people write, or comments. But the idea here is, even now today, before I say anything, you already have ideas. So mathematicians, y'all are mathematicians, right? Like, you do math this way. You put out draft ideas, you continuously revise and improve your ideas with math. You iterate, you revise your thinking all the time. That's just how you do your math research. It's how we learn anything new, just by trying and trying again. Shows that it's a human being doing things, like it's just normal how we learn anything. There's this misconception, right, where we think about math as you're either good at it or you're not, you're going to be right or you're wrong. And really it's more, we're continuing to improve our thinking all the time. It doesn't have to be perfect or finished. Normalizing making mistakes and fixing them. Right. So we want students to think about that. So the first thing I want to say is that this is valuable because students have ideas about drafting and revising, but they don't connect it to math. Would anyone like to unmute and elaborate on any of these ideas? Oh, I love it.
Sometimes one of the struggles I've had during pandemic has been that remote teaching requires that we collaborate digitally. And I think my students have a higher threshold for how developed a thought has to be before they'll go through typing it or representing it in a digital format. And so whiteboards have been more rough drafts, whereas digital whiteboards haven't. And so I really feel the dip in this. So it's like safe to get their ideas out. They don't have to be fully formed. They can fix them as they go, kinds of things.
And what's the electronic equivalent of this whiteboard space? Like, this is fascinating, right? Like the whiteboards, they can just put it out there, but they feel like if they type it, it has to be more real. That's what you're saying?
Sometimes the typing, it's also just harder to draw on a digital whiteboard unless you have like the perfect technology, and then everything has to be charged and connected and shared. It's just, there's just barriers.
Yeah, we want people to feel more free. That's so true. And I don't know where everyone's status is at. So I'm at the University of Delaware, where we're all face-to-face right now, but we're fully masked and everyone was required to be vaccinated. But Brian, are you suggesting some of your teaching is still fully online?
I've been remote in my entire 2 years here at Long Beach.
Oh, wow. Okay. There's such a range. It's so geographic. Like, our experience of our pandemics have been geographically bound, right? Yeah. Anyone want to elaborate on any other ideas here, theirs or someone else's?
I mean, there's this comment that this is how mathematicians do math, right? Like there's just revising and resubmission process, but it's really much broader than that, right? It's really how anyone ever learns anything is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitions are like students often experience them as this universal thing that they get first, but they're like the 150th draft.
They evolved.
Of the concept, yeah.
Yeah, like if you look at textbooks from 150 years ago, the definition of a term looks different than textbooks from even 10 or 20 years ago, right? So the field changes. I mean, yes, for sure. So we want students and each other, all of us, to authentically experience learning, but a lot of kids have never had math classes that feel that way, or they don't interpret their math class that way. So some of it is letting them know up front, this is what we think it means to learn, right? So I'm going to give you some examples of a 7th grade class. A teacher just says to her students in Delaware, in our math class this year, you're going to do a lot of rough draft thinking and rough draft talk. What do you think this means? And even with 7th grade kids, they can make these connections. So they say things like, oh, I guess they mean we're going to try it and possibly mess up, and it's not going to be a big deal because it's a rough draft. There's just the first writing, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and your second draft, and then your final, and your final should be perfect because you keep improving. I love their words, right? Rough draft thinking is your first thought when you just discover it, and rough draft talk is discussing your opinion with other people's opinion. And I think rough draft thinking is unfinished thinking, like you're not completely done with what you're thinking and you don't think your thinking is right. And rough draft talk is what you think, but it isn't complete and you're not correct, but you pretty much estimate what you think, but I mean, the point of sharing this, all of this with you is that one way to establish with your students that you value drafts and revising is just letting them know rough drafts are a thing. How could that connect to math? And it opens up their ideas even with young kids. And so I just wrote that rough draft thinking happens when students share unfinished in progress ideas and remain open to revising. And I really want revising to be viewed as, you know, we can keep improving our thinking. It's beyond just fixing mistakes, but that all thinking can be improved. And I love this because art will never be perfect. It will just evolve. And all of these representations are clearly a butterfly. And it's just their evolution, right? And so even, you know, your proofs, when you make a proof or you make an argument, it may be a good argument, but you might be able to make it more elegant or more concise or more convincing, but the argument could still be correct. And we really want students to move beyond this correct and incorrect and more toward continually involving our thinking. I have been working on this idea for a long time. I had a study group with secondary math teachers in Delaware in spring of 2016, and we were all trying to figure out how to get kids more involved in classroom discourse. So we were reading about how to support students to participate in talking about math. And we were reading about exploratory talk, and the teachers decided to call it rough draft talk because that label made more sense to kids. And everything I know about this, about rough drafts in math class, just comes from introducing the idea to other people and them telling me what they've done. And so some of that will be about us today, like in our post-secondary college teaching. How do we incorporate the idea of drafting? So I first wrote about this with 3 middle school teachers in math teaching in the middle school. I thought I was done. I wrote a short article, and then more people kept sharing more and more ideas, and it turned into a book that came out in April 2020 during the pandemic. So rough draft talk means you're sharing your exploratory draft ideas. But a lot of kids think when you call on them to share their thinking during class discussion that they're supposed to share their final drafts and they're presenting their final draft thinking, but we want people to keep learning through talking. And so calling things rough draft talk helps people realize, oh, the conversation is supposed to be continuing to learn. And rough draft talk sounds like, you know, it's abrupt, starts, stops, expressions of uncertainty like my brain hurts. It's because we're using communication to work on continuing to understand. Because anytime we're trying to understand something new, talking through it helps us. And so with the teachers in Delaware, we read chapters from a book called Exploring Talk in School, this book here. And we were thinking about this idea of let's be exploratory when we have conversations. So my friend Francis Sue, he wrote a lovely blog post, which is here, and I'll put it in chat. Yeah, it's definitely more than just a label. There's got to be a purpose. We're talking to continue to learn. Thanks, Brian. And Francis wrote a whole blog post about the connection between teaching math like you teach writing. And this is just one of the aspects from that blog post. A math class should be an environment where students feel free to share their thinking and feel no shame about brainstorming. Encouraged to use language that makes sense to them, even if the language isn't necessarily what mathematicians would view as perfect. We know our understanding is in progress, it's limited, but we're trying to revise our thinking as our thinking expands. And right, this is what we do when we're asking and answering mathematical questions. We're starting to work on a problem together, and we're working with a collaborator, and we're thinking about the imprecise language at first because the ideas are still fuzzy, but we still end up trying to understand each other. And then the language tightens as we try to communicate with each other and as our understanding grows. Doing math is a process, and we want students to have that experience too. So throughout this talk, my friend Drew, I'm going to ask him to share bits and pieces. And so I did a little Google stalking, times when I found Drew thinking about rough drafts in math class. And so a colleague said that she was thinking about including rough draft math in relationship to proofs. What are other people thinking about? And Drew said, okay, maybe I haven't tried that, but we think about research mathematics. So could you say any more about this?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about how I do math, if I want to prove a theorem, right, I start out with a stack of paper, right, and scribbles all over it. It's very, very rough. And then, you know, it's probably going to be lots of pages of incorrect stuff if I actually figure something out. And that's just the first draft, right? That's the rough draft. And then I'm going to think about actually teching it up in a way that I might share with somebody to get some feedback on.
I mean, students don't always, they themselves may not have had that, right? And so you telling them that could be one thing, but what is it like to give them that experience too, right? So how do we think about our math classes as a way to give them an experience of actually engaging in math like mathematicians do? So that's one rationale, right? So so I put a note to myself, ask everybody, what can we do to recreate the practice of doing math as mathematicians do in our classrooms? Like, what do people think about that? Feel free to type or unmute.
I did a thing for a couple of years where, well, many years, where my students sort of write a book together. And so they like get their hands dirty before class, they come together, we have these conversations, then they sort of like draft pieces of it based on that conversation, and then they put it in this public space, and they eventually all sort of decide and revise this thing to say like, hey, we built this thing, do we think it's as good as it could be? And that feels sort of kind of like writing a paper together.
And this collective knowledge building too, right? Like we don't usually do our mathematical work in isolation. It's richer when we can think together, and you want to give the class that experience. So what's the book about?
The content usually. So they'll take a set of questions and turn it into a textbook for the class, and many of them are future teachers, so it's something they can imagine being useful in their future teaching as well.
And documenting their knowledge collectively.
Exactly. Sometimes it's portfolios instead, but functionally it's the same thing.
Yeah. Anyone else have more to say about recreating that practice of doing math like we all do as mathematicians?
When I run my IBL geometry and this semester it's analysis, I'm pretty explicit about being like, okay, you are a research team, I'm the advisor, right? That's essentially the role I'm gonna play. And here, like, pretend your advisor has given you like some problems to solve or some problems to think about. Now, you know, you have to, discuss amongst yourselves and try different approaches, talk to each other about what you're doing, and try to come up with some sort of solution or approach or whatever it is to whatever I'm asking you to do. So I'm very explicit about making that comparison.
I mean, that's why we do the IBL situations. Like, we want inquiry because we want people to ask mathematical questions and pursue authentic answers to those in community. And right, so being really clear with them about why we're having them do what we do. Yes. So I want to talk about these 4 different ideas about how we can incorporate rough drafts and revising into math teaching and learning. And I want to give examples of what teachers have done in K-12 classrooms, but think about how that relates to us in our college teaching. And so classroom culture, student-to-student discourse, revising and reflecting are 4 ideas I want to talk about today. So specific to classroom culture, that's we intentionally work to build that community that's makes students feel safe to take intellectual risks together. We take their rough draft thinking and we normalize it. Like, this is just what we all do. We put our drafts out there and we revise them. That's just how we learn. And we position those draft ideas as having strengths. They're in progress, but there's merit to them. There's assets to them that we can all learn from your drafts. Student-to-student discourse. I often say, like, I can't revise my thinking until I have some other idea to entertain, right? So let's entertain another student's perspective. So we have to make student thinking public or known to each other so they can learn from each other. But then revising, like, how often are we intentionally saying, this is a moment where you're supposed to revise? How can we explicitly incorporate moments to revise into our classrooms? But then also reflecting, giving students opportunities to reflect on growth in their thinking. So I first want to start with culture. Culture building, I think one of my favorite things that a lot of K-12 teachers have really grokked with or gotten into is this notion of rights of the learner. And so my friend Crystal Craig, who works in San Antonio, has written about rights of the learners. And she learned about this through a teacher in Tucson, Arizona, Olga Torres. So letting students know, in this room, you have rights. As you learn math, you have the right to be confused. You have the right to say what makes sense to you in whatever way makes sense to you. Of course, you have the right to make mistakes. You're just learning. You have the right to revise. You have the right to share your unfinished, incomplete thinking and not be judged. And the way a lot of K-12 teachers use this is they'll have students say, in this lesson, what right do you want to think about today? And how are you going to enact it? So reflecting before the lesson. Or maybe at the end of the lesson, which right did you use today? And how did you enact it? Or how did you recognize one of your peers using this right? How did they enact it? And so just really helping them develop that awareness. So I'm just sharing this as a powerful idea that's been useful for teachers. But in general, this notion of culture is framing, helping students to think about what it is we're doing here. What's the business of this room? So again, Google stalking on Twitter, thinking about framing. For when you teach, like Tian, you were saying IBL, when you teach with inquiry, we ask students to learn in public, share their thinking with each other out loud, presentation. But to help students buy into this, we might need to change how we frame it. So Drew, can you share a little bit about what you wrote here? It was a long time ago.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been doing the same kind of things in my class. What is this, 2019? So
Right.
2017, trying to do more inquiry in my classes. But then after I read your book, I started thinking about how to make kind of subtle language changes in the way I frame things for them. And I think it helped them feel a little bit safer, like you were saying, in putting their ideas out there. So kind of that phrase, rough draft work, right? So just repeating that, hey, this is just a rough draft, that kind of makes them feel safer to go ahead and just throw something on the whiteboard. It's okay, it's a rough draft. Or when asking them to share with the class, right? Not necessarily asking them for their answer or anything, but what did y'all make of this problem? Where did you go with this? How did you approach this? Rather than trying to say something that kind of implies that I'm looking for an answer or something like that.
I mean, it's wild just saying, it's okay, it's a draft. And then the tool of the whiteboard, those two things combined create this freedom. Like, it's like letting the air out of a balloon. People like, oh, whatever I say is welcome. Oh, I love your interjections in chat, Brian. Can you say more about that? Conjecturing.
So this was a day that the digital whiteboard worked out well for us. We just sort of wrote down all the properties of sequences and whether like convergent and bounded and monotonic
Yes.
and things like that. And then whether we thought all sequences, all subsequences, there's always at least one subsequence, or it's possible, but maybe not, and well, depending on which interpretation of that. And the students just sort of like decided which ones they thought had connections to each other. And from this, we built some really powerful ideas, but they were just like comfortable saying like, I think we should draw an arrow here. And it was one of my favorite days last semester.
There's just something about saying your conjectures are welcome. Like your drafts are welcome. I'm not judging you. I just want to know what you think, right? But then you get these incredible insights and ideas when people feel more free. So there's just, what are we going to do intentionally to build the culture where students feel more free? Like, I think I put that I wanted to hear from people, like if they have other ideas about how they could help students feel free to feel safe. Like, how do you help the students to feel safe to just share whatever's on their mind? Maybe it's framing it as a conjecture. Maybe it's having a cool enough problem that's weird enough or unusual enough that they feel like, whoa, I don't know, I'm just going to put it out there. Maybe it's the whiteboards. Like, what do you do to help people feel intellectually free?
My Twitter handle is the word ninja, and my students gave it to me many years ago because they decided that there were infinite layers below what we were attending to that could make the language more precise and better. And that at any given time, I was sort of like choosing to let us stop at a good enough revision. And so that was sort of that. So the word part comes from the language, and but the idea was that sort of like there's always better ways to say the things we have. So why do we? Who cares if this one's not perfect? That's not possible.
That's so interesting. So it's both good enough and potentially improvable at the same time.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Word ninja. Love that. So it is something that we're constantly thinking about, how we can create that safe space, but it's kind of wild how it's fine, it's your draft. It goes counterculture to how a lot of our students are coming to us thinking about math. So where are our ideas coming from, where we can revise our thinking? They can come from their peers, right? So what can we do to get student to student discourse going? And a 6th grade teacher I worked with said that, well, it's a round of rough draft sharing. You stop the students before they're fully done, because if you wait until they're fully done to share, they're just sharing and presenting and they're not trying to learn from each other. So if you stop them before they're fully done, then you share their drafts, then go back and revise. I like to cross-pollinate groups, like put yourself in order by your birthday or your length of your hair, or your age. And the 2 people with longest hair are the 2 people who are youngest. Move to another group and then share what your group's been doing. And then their ideas can cross-pollinate. Or yeah, jigsaws, exactly. Or this notion of learning to listen, listen to learn. Put them in pairs. You can't talk when your partner's speaking. And so you just listen to what they have to say and you don't respond to it. And then they share and you just listen and you don't respond to it. And then you go back and revise. Or like you were saying, Brian, with your group book, you create a collective product, but overall you're trying to get people to talk to each other and assume that when you're talking to each other, you assume you have something to learn from one another. And when you revise, you need alternative ideas, you need to hear from someone else, and you seek to understand rather than to critique or fix. And yes, in chat, that's right. An assumption is that the task needs to be worth talking about. It needs to be rich enough that it's worth discussing. When I was working on this book, I was initially not going to have a chapter about problems, tasks, but chapter 3 ends up being all about that point. You need tasks that are worth talking about. But, you know, if you're going to revise, your new ideas have to come from somewhere. And so getting students to talk to each other. So I remember something about these wikis or these group books. And Drew, I think you've worked on this before, right? Like having a wiki space with your students. So can you say more about that?
Well, I haven't actually figured out how to do this.
But you've thought about it, right? Like
I've thought about it, yeah, and I think I've talked to BK about it with his textbook kind of thing, right? Because right now I do a good job of getting them to put some stuff on whiteboards and do some rough stuff in class, right? But I haven't figured out a great way to, okay, now we want to really revise this and get some sort of final thing down.
The idea
yeah.
came originally, I had done things, so my students they like evidence of productive struggle in preparation for class, very, very rough draft. And they see how that's useful as preparation for class. And then we make a lot of meaning in class, but I felt that they needed to spend some time taking that really chaotic stuff and reflecting on it and trying to improve it and polish it a little bit. And when I did like individual portfolios, that it felt like they were just saying like, well, I'll transcribe the thing from class, and it felt useless. And so I had to turn that thing into a group worthy task. I had to think of something that was, I had to convince them that polishing was contributing to something, whether it's this will help you study for an exam, or this is a product you can use in the future, or you'll learn more by building this thing together kind of thing. And so it's exactly related to your idea that writing to them felt like transcribing a final draft in my, like, you know, in 2010 when I was first starting. And I didn't like that.
There's something about this collective space too. Like, how are we ensuring that it's collective and not just one person like doing the work? But the main thing I just wanted to point out, right, is if we're not letting students listen to each other, they're not able to learn from each other. And I think if it's a group project, okay, so I gave a quiz today, and I did the Howie Hua thing where you can talk to each other for 5 minutes before you start writing. And so they could talk to each other for 5 minutes with nothing in their hands, but they saw the quiz in front of them. I mean, they could collaborate and learn from each other for a period of time. So how can you create spaces where there's student to student learning? Revising. So to me, I originally thought rough drafts in math class was about making people feel safe to share their thinking when they weren't sure. But what the teachers I worked with taught me was that it's partially about letting people explicitly take time to revise their work. And so that might mean multiple drafts, trying a problem, working on it individually. Then like having students bring their work to the document camera and showing different strategies that we've strategically selected to bring up to the document camera. Now go back individually, write a next draft based on what you saw. And it wouldn't be just copying someone else's thinking, but like, how would you enhance what you first did based on your insights from a colleague? And also it has to be a rich task, right? And how does this relate to assessment? What do we do in our assessment practices that invite students to continue to revise? And I want to point out that I think of revising as more than fixing mathematical calculation errors. It's our learning and our ideas are continuously evolving. It's ongoing. Even correct work can be revised to become more concise or more illuminating with a different representation or more elegant, something like that. So sometimes K-12 teachers might think, oh, I think I mean fixing an incorrect solution, but I could mean also a new solution strategy, like a different one that also works, or a more precise explanation with, you know, different words that are more aligned with the discipline, or more detailed. Maybe your explanation wasn't elaborated enough, or maybe it was too wordy and needs to be, right? We save these file documents like final, right? More illustrative, like maybe you didn't have a representation that shows what's happening. Maybe you had more of a calculation of what you did and you need to think about like why that works, right? Like what makes sense about that. More elegant, more aesthetically beautiful, more illuminating. It could convince people other than yourself. Like our first drafts are often for us, right? And we need to write drafts for other people and convince other people. So all of this is to say, you could have an answer, you could have a correct argument, but it could still be revised. And that's what I want to push on, is that it's about improving our thinking. So we don't necessarily have time for this, but I wanted to show you, if you go to student.desmos.com and type in, this is an activity that I got from a high school teacher in Ohio. This is one thing that's so cool about Twitter, is that people just show me stuff. So this is Leah Thompson's activity. Well, she showed me this video and student work, and you can click through and see. But I made this Desmos activity based on something that Leah did with her students, and she gave me this video and she showed me her student work. You wrote a rough draft this week. 50 versions of a paper, right, exactly. So this graphing story, I'll just put myself. So the idea here is you're letting students first watch the video and engage with it. And this is a slingshot ride. And they're gonna see how it flies in the air. And they're just being asked to think about, what do they notice and what do they wonder about this ride? Hi, Karen, glad you're back. So you first just ask students, what do you notice? What do you wonder? People notice things like, I'm gonna have a stomach ache when I ride this ride, or whatever they notice. So Leah just found this video, and what do you notice and what do you wonder about what's happening? And then the kids are asked on Desmos to do a graph of the height over time, and they can rewatch the video, and then they might notice, the different oscillations and things. And then they can see their first draft, it will be brought in, and then they compare it to their second draft. So one idea here is just to give people space. Write your first draft, write your second draft, and then reflect on what's different. And then you can even have them compare to other students. So this is from Leah's students. So Leah Simon, a teacher in Ohio, this student did their first draft and their height was way up at the top. They didn't think about how the ride needed to start somewhere before it went up. And then, so you might think like, oh, what do you think about where the ride starts, where the ride begins, how many oscillations it makes? How do you get off the ride? Because you might see these over here and these over here. So anyway, the main idea here is you're giving someone multiple spaces to write multiple drafts and to get more precise. And then they can draw another graph if they want. But I just want to introduce the idea that just the notion of saying draft 1, draft 2 on the same sheet of paper, like normalizing that. And then reflecting, like it's very important for people. I'm sure we've all had that understanding of once you learn something, you feel like you've always known it, but you need to reflect back, right? To see that your thinking has grown. So I like to ask people, okay, this idea that you're working on, you used to think this, but now what do you think? And also, what are her implications for how we assess folks? So I've started to use ungrading practices where students are doing self-assessments where they get artifacts from the beginning of the semester and then later and document how their thinking has grown. And they make arguments for how their thinking has grown, which is different from performing. When I give a test, I give a grade based on how you did on this day when you sat down and took this test. But when you put forth a portfolio, you have to show how your thinking has grown and changed. And so then that's powerful for students because they're thinking about how their thinking has evolved and grown. So Drew has also been thinking about alternative assessments, and I'm sure a lot of you have been as well. Thanks, Karen. Reflecting is a critical piece to make learning deeper and more durable. So like recently, just a few months ago, Drew, you shared this. So what would you like to say about alternative grading? You could probably give a whole session on this. So
Yeah, I could, and we've even had a talk math with your friends on ungrading. Spencer
exactly.
Bagley, yeah. So that's in the archives on YouTube.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I guess just the general philosophy of instead of having just a one and done kind of thing with your assessment, just incorporating this idea of revising, as a couple of people said in the chat, that the reflection is really important. Instead of just having students, take a test and then forget about it, like reflect on what they did.
And the spirit of that being just this promoting this idea that your thinking is growing, you're revising your thinking all the time, and then helping them develop their awareness of that, because that's just a different space, and then if that's a part of them earning their grade, that's amazing. And so I love that you are all deeply reflecting on that. Not everyone does, but just connecting that to this process of drafting and revising and reflecting on growth. I just also wanted to let you know that Frances has written a bunch on this blog post about teaching math like you teach writing is connected to this idea of revising. And he wrote about, for example, you could award partial credit when students suggest a strategy, even if they don't ultimately solve the problem, they get credit for their suggestion of a way to approach it. Publicly affirm any student that offers an idea in class and build upon it. So noticing the strengths, right? We're all asset-based and strengths-based oriented, and recognizing those ideas. Encouraging students to openly discuss with other students strategies they tried, even if they didn't work. We learn from our false starts, we learn from our stuck points. Modeling our own rough drafts. We've worked on problems and we have starting points that weren't productive, but then we learned a lot from those, and modeling that. Before presenting the proof of a theorem or solution, invite student discussion, getting their ideas, like getting them to try to think about it first, then they're more primed and ready to hear about what makes sense. Giving students opportunities to revise their work for a higher grade. Okay, I teach 2 sections of a class. When I let every student revise everything, it's a lot of work for me, but it's more learning for them. And ultimately, I'm in this gig for them to learn. So I let them revise their assessments, right? Peer feedback or a final project where they take some bit of work and revise it. So I loved that Frances offered all of these ideas for how to incorporate drafting and revising. I also wanted to tell you, so we have Tien here as a Montana person. Some of our colleagues at Montana State at the Bozeman campus, Derek Williams and Megan Wickstrom, they have been teaching math asynchronously, like before the pandemic even. And so they were incorporating drafting and revising. And so right at the time of the pandemic, I asked them, Megan, Derek, can you tell me what you do? So we could help people think about drafting and revising. And so they would give a challenging group-worthy task early in the week and said, okay, you're going to share your rough draft thinking about that problem online. And then, yeah, Derek is on Twitter. He's right there. Yes. And share your draft thinking. It doesn't have to be completely correct. Then you'll discuss those draft ideas. And then you can revise based on people's solutions and your thinking that you've learned from those solutions, and interact with each other. and then you can revise your work before submitting. And so this whole post it has some group worthy tasks in it, and it has different ways that they think about drafting and revising. But what I found interesting was that they were working on asynchronous math prior to the pandemic. And, we heard some discourse early in the pandemic of whether or not asynchronous is more equitable or synchronous is more equitable. And so some thinking was asynchronous is more equitable because you didn't have to have like a strong enough internet connection to have a live conversation. And so having asynchronous options for thinking about learning, I thought was really useful. And so just to reiterate, I think if we are going to incorporate drafting and revising, we need a culture where students feel safe. We need opportunities for students to hear each other's thinking so they have input to revise. We need to explicitly and intentionally give revising opportunities in our teaching. I let students revise quizzes. I'm always telling students they're supposed to revise their work, that sort of thing. And then reflecting on how their thinking has grown. And then I like this quote: rough drafting is also for us as instructors. We're revising our own approach to teaching all the time, and we're all rough drafts of the people we're still becoming. So maybe you can put in chat, you used to think about rough drafts and math teaching, and now you think. So go ahead and put some thoughts, and then we can have some open dialogue. And I will stop sharing. So how this all started, right, is that I just was hanging out with middle school and high school teachers, and we were reading about exploring talk in school and how to create these exploratory spaces. And so rough drafts in math class it's just a concept, and you do with it whatever you do. And I've had the opportunity to curate and write, curating from people's best ideas. And really focus my writing on K-12, but I'm a college instructor too. Like, this is relevant at the college level. So Brian, you used to think that rough draft math was about first drafts, but now you think it's about revision processes. So what can you say about that?
That was the most interesting pivot in this discussion for me, because my first thing was about like lowering the barrier for them to get their ideas out, because I think a lot about that, and I do also think about the other thing that I had sort of thought of it as rough draft math is a unifying thing that ties them together in a useful way. But you were just saying that where this came from, and that was sort of my question for you, that kind of like the discussions of inquiry, this feels like very big tents. Like you already have an informal idea. Everybody already has, including children, have informal ideas about what rough draft talk and math and writing mean, and I value that, and I see how that's really useful. But I'm also kind of curious: are there things that you like? I don't know how to phrase this, but are there versions of it you think are too far, or that where it gets misapplied, or are there core things that you think if it's not there, then you wouldn't call it rough draft math?
That's a lovely question. So one thing that I don't like, and that doesn't resonate in my heart with me as rough draft math, is that when I've seen a teacher say, here's an incorrect calculation, fix it. Because it's not about what makes sense. So to me, rough draft math is about improving our thinking, improving our ideas, improving what we know and understand. Certainly, I would love for people to calculate correctly, but unless you're having a conversation about what that means, I feel like that's limited. So there's that. But other than that, Probably the only other concern I have would be if you don't position the strengths in people's emerging ideas. So even if you're talking about how to improve a calculation, talk about what made sense to them. Like they started this way and that made sense to them. Focus on what's making sense and then build on what's making sense. So I don't really view this as like fixing someone that has incorrect ideas, but building on our understandings. And I'll share one last point about that. At the end of February, I was in Michigan talking with some folks at Grand Valley State, teachers and faculty, and we were talking about the difference between revising our work and revising our thinking. And they were saying like, why would somebody keep wanting to like revise this assignment? And I actually don't care about revising the assignment. I care about improving our understanding of an idea. So I don't know what that implies for what I do as a teacher, but that distinction between revising work and an assignment and revising a concept was huge for me, because I think I was always carrying around that it was about revising a concept, and I didn't realize that some people might think I meant revising an assignment.
Thanks. Several of the things you said there remind me of Rochelle Gutierrez has a critique of the Common Core standards, practice standards. The third one, just, you know, the third one is construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. And part of her point is the word critique connotes judgments rather than, and so she would prefer something like appreciate, which feels a lot closer to your rough draft point. Like the goal is not to decide if we think it's right or wrong. The goal is to collectively use that reasoning to improve our own thinking.
I really love that point. I've revised the notion of like, what do you notice? What do you wonder? But what do you appreciate? I add that. So whenever a student comes up to the document camera, which is all the time in my class, what do you notice about their work? What do you wonder about it? But what do you appreciate? And this notion of appreciation really does get at sense making at the same time, because to appreciate something, it has to make some sense to you. So there's that. And then I focus on seek to understand before we seek to critique. Like, how do you reflect back to somebody? I hear you. I understand what you're saying. Like, that's difficult to understand what someone's saying. And if you can decenter to understand someone else's perspective, that's actually pretty deep. So I would really want people to understand each other and appreciate before they critique, because how could you even critique until you understand? So that's a big part of classroom discussions for me. Understanding and appreciating. Critique is not even the point really, because pointing out what you appreciate, you can build upon it, right?
Your documents presented the idea of submission. I'm just curious if you have a nicer word than submission. And I don't know what that comes out as, but if submission seems like very final. Okay.
When you say submission, what does that mean to you? I normally don't even think of that word. So can you say more about that?
Well, that's, you see, okay. To me, a submission is a final, right, this is it. We're now
that's what I'm going to turn in, right?
I'm going to print and good luck.
Yeah.
I've got to get on to the next thing. And
sure.
I'm really uncomfortable with the word submission if you're in a revision position or you're in something to do with that. I'm stuck for a word. I don't like submission. Okay, that's it, right? I'll leave it there.
Really
I'm putting that in print.
I always just say share.
Yeah. It's because it's not forced. A submission is it's over.
Yeah, like I'm clicking submit.
Yeah, and that's
Turning
not what you're doing, or at least I don't think it's what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm like share or tell us what's on your mind or what's your current thinking. Yeah, you're right. Like if you call it a submission, it feels like turning it in.
You know, like
that's but the point of what you're saying is what we call it matters.
Yeah.
It sends a
And,
message.
like you've just done that. So
Yeah.
what can you, anyway, but I'll leave you with that as an idea.
It's a
to go
wonderful
away
thing to
and
consider,
revise.
right? Love that.
Yeah.
I wasn't, when you started talking, Paul, I wasn't sure if you were like, if you're saying someone must submit to something.
Yeah, it's well, you see, okay.
I'm like,
so,
yeah, I
so,
don't like that word
so,
either.
so to me, submit is a very final thing.
Yeah.
It's an act has been completed, and the tribute is submitted to the deity or whatever.
And it's a
You know.
tribute. Yeah, exactly.
You know, and it sounds like a payment object, or an activity where somebody has completed a task, and you're not asking them to complete a task, you're asking them for their best effort, particularly if they can go back, excuse the phrase, and submit it a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, thanks, Brian. I'm not able to really.
Well, so for example, if I'm going to pick someone to share their thinking for the class discussion, I walk around the room and I strategically pick someone whose ideas have a lot of strength and then also could be revised. And I just say, can you go up and share at the camera? And they put their work under the camera and it gets displayed, and then they can like rework it based on people's feedback. But I don't actually think I've ever used the word submit or submission.
Yeah, it's in the presentation, and it was just.
But present is another thing, right? And
yeah.
so how are we framing this? What are we calling it? What is the point of it? But how we name it makes a big difference. For sure. Because then it changes, like, what's the purpose of it? What's the goal? What am I expected to do? And how are we thinking about this? Love that question.
Well, that's about our time. Just to do our last little announcement wrap up. Usually this semester it's been sort of every other week, but it's actually next week is our next session. It is with Vanessa Sun, talking about My Math Stories, poetry, a poetry reading, sort of about memoir, math, poetry. So everyone should definitely come back. And yeah, we're really excited about our schedule this spring, and we were honored to have Dr. Amanda Jansen, Mandy, part of our session. So please join me in thanking Mandy one more time for today's lovely discussion.
Thank you so much. Love to hang out with you all. You're amazing people. Good to be with you synchronously.